My name is Alberto. I am the Global Development Director of the Impact Hub Network. And I used to be the founder of, I was the founder of Impact Hub Milan, the first Impact Hub in Italy. And I also did various other things in the network. So I've had quite a deep experience in the social enterprise field. And today we are going to be actually overseeing exactly this. What is a social enterprise and what is a social entrepreneur? The foundational piece, so that you really understand when they walk in through your doors of your incubators, you say, that's what a social entrepreneur. I know exactly what it looks like. Tatiana.
Yes, hello, I'm Tatiana Glad, and I am based out of Amsterdam. I'm the founder and director of Impact Hub Amsterdam. And the experience I bring is a number of entrepreneurial development programs over the years, and they're theme-based, geographic-based, but also stage-based. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some experience today and meeting all of you, and really excited to see you delve into this topic and to work also with my colleagues at Global. We'll dive a little bit into the social entrepreneur versus the social enterprise. What are some of the characteristics? What are some of the language, the definitions, and introduce a spectrum to help you understand this dynamic between the creating the impact value and the finance value. In the second block, we kick off with a little quiz. Just to keep our mind sharp. And we'll go into social enterprise examples and also talk a little bit about what social enterprise might be in your context. So we'll have some time in small groups to share our contexts. And in the third block, we'll dive a little bit more into the legal parameters of social enterprise. So a little bit more into forum and the legal parameters and how they might differ across Europe, and open up to discussion and allow some time for close and reflection and some next steps. There are many different definitions, and the field is always evolving. It is evolving at quite a pace. When you look at 10 years ago, when some of us have started, in this field, and also it's contextual. So in the next slide, you have some pictures of some social entrepreneurs in my context, and these guys are Van Plastique, and they've made turning plastic into something useful their mission. And so I think, for me, that what's most important to speak at the very, very beginning, as we get into the terminologies, we get into the definitions, as we get busy with our heads, is really to speak to what I call the heart and the grit of the entrepreneur. This individual who comes passionate about something, wanting to change something, make something better, wanting to make the world a better place with a vision of something that maybe wasn't possible. There's really something special about when they walk into your space, when they walk into your program, when they walk into a conversation with you, to try and figure out what is it that really makes their heart beat. What is it that really takes gives them the conviction to do this sometimes very difficult work, where the funding is not guaranteed, where the customers aren't guaranteed, and that they have a particular vision for something that might not be there yet. And to me, this is really quite special, because this heart and this grit, is really quite, it's something that I find quite motivating in interacting with social entrepreneurs. So while, you also find that in what you might term regular entrepreneurs, I think, this is something that I would encourage you, if it's your first time delving into social entrepreneurship or impact entrepreneurship, is to take some time and get to know some of the people that are coming forth with their ideas and understand their stories, because they're all quite different, and they add, quite a bit of flavor, to the world. On the next slide is just a little wordle that I've done in my own community, when, a lot of social entrepreneurs don't like to be put into definitions. By definition, entrepreneur likes to kind of find their way out of a box. And so some of them, have sometimes been called, innovators or catalysts or conductors, or sometimes they're termed radical, or sometimes they're quite much more tempered. We've even come across intrapreneurs, people who start in organizations and then take their passion out of an organization and spin out and start something. And so, there's a number of different titles you might find, or names or labels that fly around. But really at the core of this is about people seeking positive impact in society in an entrepreneurial way. And so as we move on to the definition, and as I said, there's various definitions and they mean different things in different contexts. Here's a few ways that we found, that social entrepreneurs have been described. So we see what we often call the father of social entrepreneurship, Bill Drayton. He calls them that they're an essential corrective force, and they're systems changing entrepreneurs. So this to me is really the aspect of an entrepreneur coming in and wanting to start something. And it might be very small scale at first, but really having a perspective of changing something social, environmental, or economic, and coming from something deep within themselves. We see another definition here, that it's someone who sets up a business enterprise with the aim of alleviating a social problem. So really, there's two types, perhaps, in this way. There's the biographical, those who might have a direct lived experience of the issue. So they might have an experience of poverty, they might have an experience of environmental degradation, and they have a solution. They might have grown up in a place where they've seen the problem and they see a solution. They really, really want to do something about it and start to form an enterprise around that and get the support that they need. And then there's the career or serial social entrepreneur who sees a problem and are very motivated to solve it. Might not have the direct lived experience, but have a way of going about this problem and constructing a way forward. And so the next slide really touches on these characteristics. So I think the best way to sum up, social entrepreneurs, really that there are many characteristics that can be ascribed to them. Some of these might be common, of course, to any entrepreneur. However, there's some that are very specific to the social entrepreneurs. So for example, their motivation and their purpose for starting a social venture. Again, coming back to that story of that individual who's passionate and they have a willingness to share, these ideas. Social entrepreneurs really tend to thrive in communities where they can share and they expand, they can take on other ideas from others. So you'll see a few of, we've highlighted a few of the things that we'd like to speak to. And I think for me, there's something that I'd like to convey around this dynamic, around these practical solutions that they try and find, something really that works, something that moves beyond discussing the problem, right? Along with this willingness to take risks. It's one of the things that I found out in a discussion between social entrepreneurs and our public sector. We said, well, we have a similar goal. We want to take care of society and make it better. But the public sector is set up, right, to minimize risks and to take care of society and to make sure that we're not taking too many risks, and that there is a social safety net, whereas social entrepreneurs will sometimes take risks and not have the funding yet, but really take those steps forward. But they also, some of them are better than others at measuring and monitoring their impact. And so this is, I think, a topic that I think we'll dive into in this series a little bit more as well. And the healthy impatience. So that's something I really feel myself when I stepped into this, is that, there's a way to channel my impatience and making the world a better place, but to do so in a healthy way. We don't always like bureaucracies. We don't always, we always have issues sometimes with how somebody else can take over our jobs, or how do we, organize our organization. But there's really a sense of being able to channel our impatience into something that has a positive impact on people. So those are a few of the characteristics. And again, this might be a slide you come back to and see how that compares to some of the entrepreneurs that you meet along the way. Now, I'd like to pass it on to Alberto, and I think you'll pick up on the enterprise itself.
Thank you, Tatiana. The inspiring world of social entrepreneurs, of course, then gets bogged down, if you like, or gets anchored into the more concrete world of social enterprises. The two things are, of course, related, but they're not entirely overlapping, because in fact, social entrepreneurs very often are so, like as Tatiana was rightly pointing out, they're so driven by their passions that they kind of forget that there is this whole world of legal forms and structures, etc. And when they arrive to them, they find it difficult and impatient to be fitting in, because the world of legal forms is constantly chasing the reality on the ground. And so we find that the policy world and the legal world are often a step or two behind where the real world is. But when we talk about the definition of social enterprise, I think it's very important to recognize that there are some anchoring pieces to this. For example, the theory of Mohammed Yunus, who invented microcredits famously, and he defines a social business, which is his understanding of social enterprise. He's based in Bangladesh, so quite far from Europe, but still his influence was huge globally. And it is like an NGO with a social mission, like a non-governmental organization with a social mission, but like a business, it generates its own revenues to cover its costs. Yunus says that there should be no profit distribution, but that all surpluses should be invested into the social business. And here we find the first element, which is quite important. So what do we do with this leftover money, with this extra money? Like in a world of traditional for-profit company world, this is great. You share it with the investors, you share it with the shareholders. But here, no, it's different. We don't necessarily have these figures. And the Centre for Social Enterprise in the UK also defined it as essentially like a triple bottom line approach. Yes, you want to achieve social and environmental outcomes, but you also want to earn revenue. And in fact, in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's much stronger, the sense that a social enterprise should be profit-making, could be profit-making. And finally, we looked at the definition of the OECD. Institutional actors step into this space and they try to really bring together all the different voices. And if we look in particular, next slide, at the definition that the European Commission gives, you can start seeing the fault lines of the debate that we are facing here. It's not just whether there is profit and non-profit. The other fault line of the debate is, should the workers in a social enterprise have a reflective role in the governance of the social enterprise, just like cooperatives do? And this is something that has really torn sometimes the policy world and the world of academics and also social entrepreneurs themselves. The Commission defines a social enterprise whose main objective is to have a social impact rather than make a profit for their owners and shareholders. And it operates by providing goods and services for the market in an entrepreneurial and innovative fashion. So there's a lot about the enterprise world that you are carrying with you, because you're coming from traditional incubators, and you will be able to apply it completely into this world of social enterprise. But there's an added dimension, as I said, that is going to be quite tricky, if you like. The spectrum of social enterprise, next slide. This gives you a better perspective, a view of exactly what we're talking about. On the left-hand side, you have traditional charities, not-for-profits. Your ActionAid, your whatever it is. They are actually in this part. They don't generate revenues. They are totally grant dependent. And then as you're moving up the scale towards the right-hand side, you eventually end up in the traditional business world. So maximizing profit, McDonald's is down here, okay? In the middle, you have this kind of hybrid zone. And I think this is where the two worlds touch, and it's where the social enterprise world started developing more effectively, because they essentially sit between these two worlds, sometimes borrowing more from the first, and sometimes borrowing more from the second. The world of social revenue-generating social enterprises can also be a hybrid world. And we'll see this a little bit later on when we talk about legal firms. In other words, social entrepreneurs choose to have a for-profit arm and a not-for-profit arm in order to be able to operate into these two different worlds. And it's not uncommon. In fact, 20% of social enterprises worldwide have a hybrid dual status. And finally, cooperatives. We rightly put cooperatives at the center of the spectrum because they are, first of all, one of the oldest forms of social enterprise, because they were born in the 19th century, but also because they are pervasive, and they have 1.2 million people that are 1.2 billion people, sorry, who are members of these cooperatives. So they employ millions of people worldwide. They are a fundamental force in Europe and beyond for both achieving social outcomes, but also for economic value. And so this is where cooperatives should sit. But of course, again, there's the debate around, is a cooperative always a social enterprise? Should a social enterprise always be a cooperative? Not necessarily. And here I am going to stop. On the bottom bit, you also see the world of finance, of course, venture philanthropy sitting between grant making and social investment. We have EVPA here in the room. And obviously, again, it's a hybrid structure that has to bridge these two worlds. And that's why it becomes, essentially difficult to relate to sometimes. I would say that a lot depends on what incubators like yours advise their entrepreneurs to do, because when they arrive, very often they don't even have a legal form set up. And so how you advise them and how you tell them what the spectrum is will inform then their own decisions. But for some of them, the passion is what drives them. And maybe they will see a value in having a for-profit company because they think that they can raise more investments that way and they can actually maximize the impact through a rapid growth. Maybe they really care about employees having a voice in the governance, so they will choose another form. So it really speaks to their values, first of all. And I think the role that incubators like yours should play is not to point them in the right direction, is to give them the range and help them choose for themselves, because this is really where the crux of the matter is.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There is a different understanding in Europe and in the United States between what social entrepreneur as someone who is addressing social and environmental issues in Europe, So regardless of whether it's a green startup or if it's a social startup, a social entrepreneur in Europe covers the whole spectrum of social and environmental. In the US, instead, a social entrepreneur only addresses social issues. And then you have the green enterprise sector, which is about the environment. And the two are distinct also legally. So there's lots like legislations around the green that are distinct from the ones around social. And that's what the difference is between the US and Europe. But we are in the camp of Europe in that sense. When we talk about social, we include also, of course, all the environmental missions that they have, because often they are overlapping as well. Environmental issues cause social problems cause environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. They're all defined. And then your first question, does the Impact Hub network have a view? Well, as you know, we are a network of about 103, 104 centers worldwide. And so we have from the Impact Hub in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, who has on the board Mohammed Yunus. So they're a social business, clearly. And so they advocate that. You have social cooperatives like the Impact Hub in Florence, which are firmly in the space of cooperatives. You have for-profit and not-for-profit hybrids. There's a bit of everything in the network. So we don't have a unified, like this is what a social enterprise is. And I think it would be wrong to have that. I think we adapt to local context because every single local context also has a legal and regulatory framework that you have to relate to. But I think ultimately we start off exactly like Tatiana did with the individuals. So we start off with recognizing that behind the enterprises, behind the legal form there, sit people, and people are what matter, and what the values that they profess are what matters. So if we start from this starting point, it suddenly becomes much simpler to relate to each other because people care about issues around the world in the same way, regardless of what the status of a social enterprise is. And that's where I think we can draw a commonality around us that can bind us together. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'd love to add and build on that with my perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Is your second question is something I'm incredibly passionate about, is this interlinkage actually between social, environment, and economic. So part of what's happened in the sort of past sustainability world has been there's become triple vision between these three. As the triple bottom line was named and saying we need social, environmental, economic impact, they become more siloed, whereas the intention was that we need to recognize there are deep interconnections, right, between the three sort of lenses. And so one of the things that I feel incredibly passionate about is looking at the environmental and also economic issues as social issues in themselves, right? So when you look at social innovation and looking differently at how we approach our planet, how we approach our economic system, how we approach these issues that have come to be, to me, that is ultimately a social problem. It's our relationship, right? With ourselves, with each other, with our planet, with our natural resource, with our capital. And so to me, social is much broader than sort of a smaller social act, but all those small social acts add up to a collective, how we are as social beings on this planet. So that to me is something that I feel incredibly passionate about. And then the first question, to me, it's a question about what's the impact you're trying to scale. So what I've learned through this work over the last years has been making a discerning between scaling an enterprise and scaling impact. Right. And if you ask yourself, or you sit with that entrepreneur, as Alberto said, right, that's incredibly passionate and they're sitting there and you're not looking at them necessarily trying to just grow their enterprise. And you ask them a question about what would scale your impact. There are different ways. And that doesn't only mean becoming the next multinational or becoming the next unicorn. There are various different forms. We did a project many years ago called Benisi, an EU project where we looked at how you scale social innovation. There are different ways to do that. And some of entrepreneurs are doing that through open source. Some are doing it by creating different types of joint ventures and partnerships. Some are doing it by creating more like we did it by a networked approach, a bottom-up distributed approach. So I hope that helps. Maybe
obviously Impact Hub is a social enterprise. Impact Hubs are social enterprises, and we are a network of social enterprises with at the heart a social enterprise engine as well. So we are technically, I think we are the largest in the sense of like more scaled to more countries around the world, social enterprise in the world. But if you know of a bigger one, yes, please let us know, because we're always looking for someone that's bigger than. I was commenting. Thanks for your comments. I was commenting myself with Tatiana, I think the day before yesterday, and I was saying that if you go onto the Shell website, it's almost like they're a social enterprise, right? Because now the language that even traditional businesses are using is so, like stuffed with we are great at having an impact as social issues that we're addressing. So actually, this is a really, really bad thing that's happening, because the real social entrepreneurs see the language eroded out of their feet, so that they're talking the same language as these other companies, and they're thinking, well, what makes me different now, you know? And I think that's where the public needs to be very discerning, because I think, and there's a role that we can play also ourselves in making sure that the public is understanding very well. There are certifications that we'll see later on, the certifications that social entrepreneurs use very often. They don't do it because they need the certification themselves. They do it as an external signaling. They need something that sets them apart from traditional businesses. And so you're right in saying that all enterprises should be addressing social issues. That's the origin of entrepreneurship. I think that the heart of entrepreneurship is that, like, I see something that doesn't work and I want to fix it. But it also speaks to something deeper in the human value, in the human values that we carry with us. So again, that spectrum again is going to be very different from place to place, but ultimately this is where people will sit on that spectrum.
Actually, Desislava and Alberto, you remind me of when I studied entrepreneurship. My professor's definition of entrepreneurship that he taught us was about an entrepreneur, someone who brings people as good or better than them together in unique ways to create new value in society. And that was kind of the way he defined traditional entrepreneurship. And one of the things I learned along the way was about, how we define value, right? And value, and this is the whole issue about sustainability, leaving out the externalities. Right? It's like we've been defining value maybe just on the economic front with entrepreneurs, and that's where we see traditional entrepreneurship. But if they're smart entrepreneurs and you look at the state of the world and you look at, what's going on in our societies, you'll find other ways to create value that actually are superior to just the economic benefit. And I think those opportunities exist. So yeah, it's becoming a blurry line. And at the same time, how do you go back to the intention that's behind it? And that's a lot harder in a multinational company. You have to really look at the leadership and what they're trying to accomplish. Yeah, we're going to come back to the spectrum. What I'd like to do here, and we'll just be on the slide for a little bit, is to give you some examples just to start to tickle your brains and minds, and then we'll go into, as Florian mentioned at the beginning, spending some time to understand each other's contexts and such. So we'll give you a little bit of time in this segment to do that. So the impact only, and these tend to be more the charity, the NGO, these ones. But what's interesting is sometimes they do have, they do play with different models. So examples are, for example, War Child in a number of our countries. Not only do they take donations, such like that, but they create alliances to get proceeds from other folks, like the sale of, let's say, a piece of music or an album or something like that. We've got the Balkans River Defense out of Slovenia that's actually working across a number of different countries, so tapping into a wider base there. And they've formulated themselves not just as donations, but as almost like memberships that you can give on a monthly basis. So this recurring, I think we've seen this a lot in the last years, this sort of recurring donation schemes that you can do through many online platforms. Climate Action Network Europe, in itself, but also all of its members. It has a number of members, and they tend to all be NGOs and such, and have different ways of financing themselves. But these are really examples of the sort of the impact only, and it's really, the charity NGO, and often have that kind of a status. So we'll go into the examples, and we'll go a little bit more into legal after the next break. But the impact first one here is, let's say, some examples here are the ones that are revenue generating social enterprises. So a little bit more the social first, and they happen to generate revenue, and the ones that are a little bit more business, but socially driven. So, this is sometimes a blurry line for some folks. And this is where sometimes you need to really sit with the entrepreneur and talk to them and understand what the intent is, of the team and the entrepreneur behind it. But some examples here I pull out is, if you're ever in Vienna, it's a wonderful hotel to go stay at, the Magdas Hotel. It's run by people with a refugee background where they've had some difficulty finding work. And so the intent there is really, to allow for integration, but more than integration, it's really that these people bring creativity, and they bring, the flavor from their own countries, their own home countries. And so they create an atmosphere that's multicultural and that's reflective of those different cultures. And so the impact is, beyond just running a hotel, it's very much on societies through the food that they serve. It's through the different, the different materials that they use and such like that, how the rooms are decorated and such. And so the experience is really, to create an impact experience. That's an example there that I would put. I think of Fierce Women that started, it's a card game essentially that promotes and celebrates women's contributions in society. But what's interesting is, there's, in a sense, it's generating revenue through selling this card game. But what's interesting is that IKEA actually noticed the value of this initiative and then offered to sell the cards in their store. So there's also, how do you amplify just selling one-on-one these products and find partnerships that allow you to have more impact and actually create more revenue to have more impact in that way. We've got examples of socially driven businesses. So Belly Water sells water, but what they've done is they've embedded in their business model to become CO2 neutral, to make sure that when they're selecting their water sources, that they favor rural areas where they can have the best social impact and really sustain employment in these rural areas. We've got examples of Apivita in Greece that are essentially selling cosmetics, but make sure that they're from naturally derived active ingredients or plants of the Greek nature. So it's really celebrating Greek nature, beehive products, organic essential oils, and such like that. And so their own R&D department really looks for innovations and new extraction methods that do less harm on the planet. We've got, Too Good To Go, which, are across a number of European cities. So again, it's an app, it makes money through an app, it makes sure that people get meals. They reach more than 9.5 million users. I recently looked up. It amazed me that they did. And they've, saved a lot of food by making sure that they connect customers to restaurants and make sure the unsold surplus food doesn't end up in the bin, and that it offers, still meals to people before it goes bad. So really closing the loop on that. We've got examples of finance first, so traditional business. This is something that sometimes in the spectrum people discard this, but there are examples of traditional business in their course of business, doing well. Lego has a whole initiative around children and learning, and I think won a major CSR award for that, for their approach to learning and children. You see H&M is embedding more and more in their product lines, how to have less impact in their textile lines and their supply chains. They're looking for solutions along their supply chains. And you have Danone Dairy. So Danone Dairy is interesting. It's a subsidiary of Danone, and particularly the one in Ireland that has been a certified B Corp, and to really look at how they have changed the way that they do work in terms of being a much more certifiable business for how it's, typo, for how they look at their production facilities and how they look at plant-based foods instead of just dairy, and how they've been innovating in that way. So that doesn't mean all of Danone is this, and there has been some different discussion about Danone, about how committed they are to it, but they've taken a subsidiary and moved in this direction. So it's, to me, an interesting move of traditional business to try and embed it more in their business. And then, as Alberto said, sometimes on the spectrum, it's like, well, where do we put cooperatives? And cooperatives, I think, bridge both the purpose and the sort of venture type. Some people start with purpose and look at the form. Here, some people are passionate about cooperatives and start like that and really look at what a collective of people can do. And I think there's a few different examples. Some of them come around collective social purpose, such as affordable housing or integration of those distant from the labor market, such as this one in France, Geraterie, which facilitates the integration of unemployed people who confront difficulties in entering the labor market. So they are revenue generating. They do work with waste sorting, household, industrial, electronic waste, and such like that. And they're a blend between being revenue generating and also receiving support from the state for what they do to integrate people. Perhaps the most famous cooperative is Mondragon in Spain. It has over 250 cooperatives operating in 4 sectors. They operate in finance, industry, retail, and knowledge. But they're all united in sort of there's this larger entity as a federation. They're really united by their humanist concept of business. So it's really a strong philosophy of participation, solidarity, about this, their culture. It's really infused in the business culture that there's a shared mission, and they adhere to a certain number of principles and values in how they act, but are doing business. And it's one of the largest companies, I think, in the country, not one of the most well-known cooperatives in the world. And some cooperatives come around, utility provision. We've been seeing that a lot of people are coming together, particularly in Germany. There's, I think, now over 1,000 energy cooperatives. And this is, quite a trend that's growing, where citizens come together, and some of them have started just to bulk buy, to say together we can buy solar panels for cheaper together, and we can get them on all of our houses in this particular area. But now you're seeing the citizens are really taking a direct stake in the transition of cleaner energy. So taking a more systemic perspective and connecting their action on the ground to this bigger systems change. And so you're finding that cooperatives are coming together to invest, I think, over 1.35 billion euro already I've seen in Germany around renewable energies. So actually running wind farms, developing and owning biomass facilities. And so this constitutes now about a third of the total capacity of renewable energy in the country as a move. So I'm just going to hop on, and then we'll offer you this back to get into discussion in your own context. But what's really important is that across the spectrum, right, is really access to market. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about this, and this relates to how you can support social enterprises. So access to market is really essential for enterprises to develop and become more self-sustaining. And they can run into a number of barriers, right? There might be a lack or limited, actual capacity or managerial capacity or even time capacity within the social enterprise to really build these effective strategies. And so training, like many of your organizations might offer, is important. The networks, your communities, those people that you have access to around you are also very, very important in that way. But here you see, we've put kind of the main points here about access to markets that, hopefully can help you, that it's really important that to understand the social enterprises really do also have increasing advantages. They're getting access to public markets through public procurement schemes. Some of these are formalized in some places, some of these are less formalized, but there's definitely an opportunity area that I know many municipalities and governments are looking at. There are sometimes tender calls that specifically, ask for social enterprises, or more and more for making sure that responsible business practice is in these tender calls, is embedded in the responses. Also access to private markets in many ways. We're seeing consumers, really wake up to a lot of what they want their products to represent, how they want to spend their money. And we're also seeing that a lot of social enterprises are using the opportunities, that are offered here by leveraging new technologies. And I think we've seen this particularly in COVID. We've done a study in our own network around food entrepreneurs and showing how social entrepreneurs in the food sector have really leveraged the sort of digital side to innovate supply chains, to gather people around, to make new connections to farmers who were in need of new markets as well, and together finding new ways forward to feed people in sustainable ways. So some ideas there. One of the I don't know, how many of you know, maybe just hands up, have heard of BiSocial? Where you are? A few of you heard of BiSocial? These campaigns are growing. If you're great, a few of you have. So this is really about, a campaign to really create new markets, to what I say, shift from the old economy to the new. So these campaigns around making consumers, but largely businesses, aware. So this has been largely focused in the UK. It's a campaign that actually really head-on addresses large businesses and asks them to procure from social enterprises. And I think they've set some economic goals around that. Like saying, can we get large businesses to spend $1 million on social enterprises in this campaign? In the Netherlands, a campaign happens in partnership with the 4 largest cities. And we've been involved in this and hosting a brokering event. So it's a little bit more about bringing in the social enterprises, bringing in the corporates so they can find each other, build relationship and hopefully make some business deals. And BiSocial Ireland is interesting because they run a campaign, but they also maintain a year-long directory to find social enterprises. So you can kind of look at catering, transport, healthcare, such like that, and find which social enterprises, are an option to be a provider for that service. If you're looking for something in the social sector and to support social enterprises in your own local environment. So those are some examples of BiSocial campaigns. Alberto, I just want to pick on you. Do you want to add anything about BiSocial campaigns?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I think is quite striking is how many social entrepreneurs come to the doors of our hubs and of your incubators with a B2C model, and how misguided they all are, because B2C is really a hard one to crack, business to consumer. You want to direct them to B2B, and more social enterprises, I think, are shifting into the space of the B2B, recognizing that there is an opportunity. It's simpler because you get like a handful of buyers and you've secured your revenue for the whole year, as opposed to chasing millions of customers. And then generally speaking, I think it's a much more simple way to help social entrepreneurs. The BiSocial campaign, in fact, yes, it had a public remit, like it's really speaking to the entire UK population or Ireland population, but it's really targeted at businesses that buy from social enterprises, because they also have that capacity to, for example, pay for a whole year of supplies in advance, which actually speaks to the cash flow issues of social entrepreneurs. Typically, they have cash flow all over the place. And so this is a really useful campaign to also back in your countries if you don't have it, because it's essentially what social enterprises should all be about. They should be about maximizing their revenues so that they can have maximum social impact.
And I think one of the reasons we wanted to include this in this module to share with you is that many of you do have networks, are happy working with traditional enterprise. So as you move into the social impact space, it's also an interesting way to leverage your current network to create those new connections, perhaps, to encourage traditional business to maybe move along the spectrum a little bit, and see how they can achieve some of the impact goals in partnership with enterprises. It's one of the things that we've been looking at is how can we actually really, it's not about driving old business out, but it is about, making these connections between what I would call the traditional business, right? And some of the new impact entrepreneurs, and creating new ways of working together. And, business support organizations like us sometimes play a role in creating a really good, safe environment and helping people make these kinds of good agreements, or understand each other better, because sometimes the cultures or intentions are a little bit different. So I would say that that's a very interesting role for you to look at in your own context, perhaps. And I think the last slide that I just wanted to share here before we go into a little bit of digestion is around the skills and business development support. And I'm sure there can be many, slides here, because many of you do this already. But there are more and more dedicated initiatives, coaching, mentoring programs that are available to social entrepreneurs. We see a lot of providers that themselves are going through their own look at their own values, their own willingness and interest to contribute to the world on social, environmental, and economic issues and betterment, wanting to dedicate their skills in business development support. So the mentors, the experts, it could be the legal firms you have around you, it could be the banks. We're seeing more and more people be available in that way. And I think that's something you can look at in your network as well. And of course, many of these support structures, like the networks that we're all a part of, right? So we're all a part of these networks that are already committed to supporting the development of entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs. And there are more and more growing. So you might see smaller, more regional developed ones. You might see thematic ones based in specific industry sectors. So there's really, this sort of ecosystem approach of different players you can bring in to support entrepreneurs. I mean, I can reflect on that. I think it's a question I live every day, right, in this context and in almost every conversation, right? And also depends where you come from and where, I mean, to me, I see no way forward by being more regenerative on the planet. That's my very personal perspective. But I do recognize that people have different starting points. Businesses have different starting points. For some people, this is absolutely new and they're just waking up to the sustainability journey. There are some still in denial that our resources are forever, unlimited. So there's usually, when I'm with a flip chart, I draw this little curve, right? And there's sort of, the peak of anything, the peak of before something, a system's going to break down, and you go, which side of the curve are you on? You might be looking at these, unlimited resources. I can keep going and keep going, or go, oh my gosh, it's too late, right? So I think you can find yourself anywhere on that, your own spectrum in that way. But to me, it's about, if you're educating yourself, right, as a business support intermediary, as an incubator, right, as a mentor, as an expert, you're better able to draw on a variety of experiences and a variety of examples to help anyone wherever they are, move along a little bit more. What I find is that if you go too hard in, right, with the more activist, the regenerative, story, you can alienate people because it's too far away. It's too complicated. It's too far away. So I find I have to temper my impatience sometimes of how far do I go. Sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I don't, to be, quite blunt with you about that. But I think it's really, we're going beyond the need for a business case now. I mean, that has shifted a lot in the last 10 years from where we started as a network. When I look at where we started, we had to still try and explain to people that we could do business by doing good. And now you have all kinds of networks that are dedicated to this. I mean, we've seen the shift already in just 10 years, quite a massive shift. So I don't know if that helps, but these frameworks help. So the biggest key, Kate Raworth says this about the donut economy, say there's nothing new. You can trace back sustainability frameworks 20 years. This is stuff that I've learned 20 years ago. But what it is that she made really effective communication around a strong visual. So I think that's the challenge in some of our work, is how to communicate clearly about it.
Thank you, Tatiana. It's not actually so complex, I think, but it's definitely something that the moment we hear the word legal, it's like, for at least here, I have a brain like mine. My brain shuts down. It's like, oh God, this is really boring. I'm gonna actually fall asleep. And actually, what I found in this investigation that we did, always with the government of Jordan, which is like a strange thing is happening now, is that that it really does, in this moment, inform a lot of the landscape around the world, and that the fact that it's so fast moving and so changing, as I said before, puts you in a really complicated position when you want to advise in an informed manner entrepreneurs. So the first thing that I would say is check in your country what the situation is and where it's going, because every country in Europe is different from that point of view. You have structures that vary from cooperatives to startup companies to new generations, hybrid forms, etc., etc. And as I said before, 20% of social enterprises end up by having dual status, for profit and not for profit. So they target different stakeholders, if you like. The practices are passed on from country to country, and they're evolving one on top of each other. So it's also really interesting how people were looking at the UK a lot at the beginning, and now they're not looking at the UK anymore, but they're looking at other places like Malaysia, like a lot of countries out there are doing some really fantastic work. Turkey, for example. Next slide, please. So a useful way to distinguish this. Yeah, thank you. A useful way to distinguish this is to break it down into essentially these 4 categories, if you like. One is the distinct legal form, and another one is the legal status. And we'll look in a second as well, what's the difference between the two. At the global third-party certification, and then of course at all the self-regulation and hybrid forms that entrepreneurs do, the practical, like landing on the ground. Let's look at the legal form first. So a legal form is essentially a law in your country that establishes as a separate legal entity a social enterprise. It has its own parameter, it has its own incentives, it can be fiscal incentives, it can be other types of incentives, but fundamentally, these are standalone legal forms, okay? You have, for example, the community interest company in the UK, you have the benefit corporation in California, you have the social welfare enterprise in China, cooperatives in Italy, for example, etc., etc. So these are the legal forms. Now, the complexity of a legal form is it takes a long time to get through Parliament. And by the time a Parliament approves a law, typically, that establishes an entirely new form, it's already outdated because the field has moved forward. And also, it's really difficult to uptake it. The community interest company and also the law on social enterprise in Italy, it took a long time for organizations and entrepreneurs to say, okay, yeah, I can see the value of this and I'm going to do this now. So there's that kind of downside. On the other side, it's like you can really see them out in the legal space. They stand out and they have their own laws and their own everything. Instead, the legal status, which is becoming more popular as an approach. Next slide. Sorry, I actually spoke about this one before. Let's move. Sorry, I forgot one point. The work integration social enterprises, which are not necessarily a legal form, but they're very common across Europe, and they are essentially enterprises that are helping people gain employment from a vulnerable background. So there's a classic segment of enterprises that are like that, and they're called WISEs, work integration social enterprises. They don't necessarily have, though, a distinct legal form in every European country as such, okay? Some of them do, some of them don't. And then when we're looking at the legal status, so the legal status is instead sort of like a labeling that is applied onto the existing framework of legal forms. So you have your companies, you have your charities, you have your foundations, you have your cooperatives, everything is already structured. But if any of these applies a certain set of criteria or complies to a certain set of the criteria, then they can acquire the status also of social enterprise. So it's almost like a cloak that you put on top of the existing legal structures. And this is kind of like a faster way to actually achieve often better outcomes. It's something that is present in a lot of countries across Europe, and it also fits much better with the fragmented social enterprise ecosystem we were mentioning before. What we're also saying is that it's about external signaling rather than internal alignment. So in other words, social entrepreneurs really need the market and consumers and companies to understand that they are different. And that's why they put these cloaks on, but it's not necessarily because it really dramatically changes the work that they do. Sometimes it does, but essentially most of these are still in very, very early stages. And then there's third-party certification, which is sort of like the obvious and the kind of like continuation of this legal status, is when a third party, so in this particular case, we gave 3 examples, which is the B Corp certification in the US, the Economy for the Common Good in Austria, and Social Enterprise Mark in the UK. So these are 3 different labels, like the Fair Trade label, like the whatever labels you want to choose, and an organization can actually comply and fulfill the criteria so that actually they then become a B Corp, for example. And there's a number of impact hubs, for example, which are B Corps. The B Corp certification is recognized internationally, and this is particularly useful, the third-party certification, the moment you actually, as a social enterprise, begin to look at the international markets. And so you have a label that is actually recognized abroad, and they say, oh, okay, so you are a B Corp, I can recognize what you are, and so it makes sense to have it. So a lot of the ones that are trading internationally acquire these third-party certifications. Again, it doesn't change their life in practice, but it does change their access to markets quite significantly. And the 3 labels are competing a bit with each other, if you like, with the B Corp certification obviously being very dominant in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, the Economy for Common Good in the Germanic area and Central European area, and Social Enterprise Mark is also emerging as a new form of international certification. But as we said before, when it comes to the reality on the ground, social entrepreneurs actually choose whatever is best for them, and how they do it is in lots of different typologies of ways. The form follows the function principle. So very often they decide the legal form on the basis of what their business model is and how they intend to have an impact in the world. So this is, for example, a case in tandem structures. Tandem structures are subsidiary relationships between sister and brother organizations. Let me give you an example. I think this is something that is particularly present in those places where you don't have a social enterprise form, and you don't even have a social enterprise status. However, you do have entrepreneurs that want to trade, and they have a social mission, and so they are technically social entrepreneurs. They sit underneath another entity, typically a foundation or a big charity, that actually guarantees for them in these tandem structures, and essentially they become an umbrella body from a legal point of view for them to be able to operate, even though they are an informal trading group. So this is something that happens in certain markets that are changing very rapidly. For example, in the United States and in Turkey. You have hybrid clusters, as we said, that mix up the different forms. And finally, the most important point I think that it should be made to any policymaker out there is that rather than creating a lot of new stuff, they should remove the barriers of what is currently in the way of entrepreneurs and in the way of social entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of stuff that is actually about decluttering and removing red tape and things like that. But of course, very often it's much more attractive to say, I have sponsored this bill for a politician. Not so. I'm going to stop here because I think legal does actually fill your brains up. And I wanted to see if there are any questions. I don't know if Tatiana want to respond, but up to my experience, essentially, whenever you have to face some form of either customer or funder, whenever some money transaction has to happen, that's when you start having to have a legal form. Like essentially, you can't operate any kind of transaction unless you have a legal form. And often that choice is very rushed, I find, rather than like really reflected and calm. It tends to be a last minute, oh, we have to do this because now there is an application to write or something. So it's not always that deep reflection. But Tatiana, in your experience, maybe.
No, I mean, I can concur with you. You just need a vehicle to receive funding. So if you're getting more donations or grants, or that's what you're doing, you might set up, in a not-for-profit kind of scheme or such like that. Or if you want to trade, right, more commercially, then you might set up as a business. This tends to kind of always be the decision that entrepreneurs have. Now there are many more forums and ways of dealing with this. So it would be also seeing, what works in your context. We spent 8 months deliberating with a lawyer, with a fiscalist and all that. We thought it was really creative to bring the experts together and say, how do we make our dream come true? That's impact first. And yet, if we were being a business, we would be criticized if you're trying to do good by doing business. If we were set up as a not-for-profit, we'd be criticized of being too social, not business-like. So we found it very hard. And this was about 12 years ago. And to be honest, the experts didn't have an answer. And they said, one of them said something very wise, that it comes down to what you want ultimately, right? So we had to kind of look inside ourselves, and we said, well, part of why we want to exist is to make sure that business is doing things differently. So we chose to be a business vehicle and to show business can be done differently. And we put all the social ethics stuff into our statutes. And the lawyer was like, companies don't realize you could do this, right? So it's also, how do you work with the system? Don't be disempowered by it. Look for what you want, what your purpose is, and how this can all support you. The good thing is these forms have evolved, right? So depending what context you're in, you might have more choices, and you might not have to sort of hack a hybrid together of some sort. So to me, there's very early on, you have to look for the best vehicle that suits your purpose to start. That doesn't mean you can't necessarily change later on. So there are, examples of ones who have started a second entity or evolved or such like that, or moved into this, or added a certification to qualify themselves. So for example, the B Corp lies on top of whatever, being a business, and it qualifies you for different things. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I would also add one more thing, that these choices, although it's true, you can then later on change things, etc., but they do tend to stick. They're quite sticky, and once you have a company and it starts accruing balance sheets, etc., you can't really walk away from it very quickly. You have to shut it down, the company. It's not an easy thing. So there's many reasons why you would want to make sure that your entrepreneurs really think hard about the options that are out there. Remember that spectrum. Think about their values, think about their business model as much as they can in the early stages, because of course there's always that uncertainty, like until you go to the market, your business model is perfect, and then that gets shattered the moment you do the first time you touch the market.
Maybe just a quick review of what we've covered so far in the past 2.5 hours that we've been together already. That we started out with the definitions, looking at the social entrepreneur, looking at the social enterprise, some of the common characteristics. We looked at the spectrum. We went into, in the second part of it, we went into some examples in the spectrum. We had our SE quiz, trying to find lies in the social enterprise world. You got a chance to talk about it in your context. I know that was one of your questions at the beginning. And, we've also tried to meet your expectation of balancing the sort of theoretical with some examples. And then this part has been like the legal framework. So what I'd like to invite you to do right now is that we're going to give you some time to kind of reflect on your own. So if you have a journal or a notebook or a place that you like to take notes for yourself, or maybe you like to draw or make a mind map, but really, maybe you've made some notes already to digest this a little bit, and to reflect on, what do you feel you can or you have to do differently when working with social entrepreneurs? I know some of you have said that you already do work with them, but maybe something shifts in your practice because of something you learned today. So maybe just take your time and review and think, what are your key takeaways or your next actions?